Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Peter Swaby. I'm Policy and Research Director at the Chartered Governance Institute UK and Ireland, and I'd like to welcome you to this session. I'm really looking forward to what we've got today because I think it is a really important issue that, certainly from our point of view as a professional body, affects so many of us all. Just a few ground rules quickly before we start. Could you all please stay on mute unless you're asked to speak? Otherwise, it will interfere with the recording of the various speakers. Could you please keep your videos on because we will be having opportunities for interaction throughout the event, and it will be great to be able to see people rather than just see a sea of names. And can you all please respect the confidentiality of anything that is shared in the breakout sessions? I mean, we're hoping that you will all contribute as well, but it's always much easier to get open conversation if we're working under the Chatham House rule with that. So that's just a few ground rules. What I wanted to talk about, just by way of introduction, is to talk a little bit about mindful exclusion and mindful exclusion in action. And for us as a professional body, this has been a really interesting journey with the Centre for Synchronous Leadership, with Justine and with Elias and with Justina, looking at the way in which we include or exclude people in the conversations that we have. Now, some of this has been unexpected for us. Some of this has been certainly unfamiliar for me. It's taken us well beyond our normal frame of reference for so many of the issues that we've looked at. But we're looking at the way in which people relate to each other in the workplace, and how common purpose rather than power dynamics is the key to success in business. And for us, this is enormously important because diversity matters. And it matters not just in an individual sense, it matters in a corporate sense as well. And having the opportunity to look at some of these issues, having the opportunity to have Justine and the team do this sort of academic standard research into some of the issues that people face, I think is really, really important for us. My key takeaway from the journey so far, I think, has been expect the unexpected. It's been not to prejudge things, because I've certainly been guilty of that. I'm sure all of us at various stages in our careers have been guilty of making assumptions, making assessments, and actually they're not always right, and we have to be cognizant of that. We have to recognize that fact in ourselves and in others. I'm not going to ramble for very much longer. I think the important thing is to get into hearing from Justine about the report. I'll just introduce her first. Justine Lutterodt, she's an award-winning business executive, organizational psychologist, and honestly, that's not as scary as it sounded when I was first told that, and an entrepreneur. Justine specializes in C-suite coaching and leadership development, keynote speaking and research. She was previously a management consultant at Monitor Deloitte and marketing director for QTS. She's an NED for the Chartered Institute of Taxation's Nomination Committee, chair of judging for the Diversity Legal Awards, and was named as one of Bromwell magazine's 30 influential female industry changemakers and one of Britain's most influential Black entrepreneurs by BE Mogul. Justine, over to you, please.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome, everyone. We are really, really excited to be here today and to have all of you here today. This has been a really tremendous journey, mindful exclusion, and actually it's a journey that started many years ago. It started in 2015 when we gathered 100 senior executives, HR leaders, employee network leaders in a room at a bank, and sort of started looking at what it means to exclude and under what conditions you would be okay being excluded, and began a provocative conversation that although it had a starting point around diversity, went much deeper than that in terms of leadership. And we were really pleased in 2019 to formally engage with the Chartered Governance Institute in a partnership around this. And in many ways, that partnership was a great example of mindful exclusion, because both of us found ourselves engaging with somewhat unfamiliar, somewhat familiar territory and learning a whole lot. So I want to start by actually thanking the Chartered Governance Institute and Peter Swaby and Sakib and Kristen and team for the journey that we've been on together, because it's been very meaningful and has allowed us to learn from and engage a much wider audience in order to have impact. So this has been a journey so far that's been exciting. But today is the beginning of a new segment of that journey, because today is the launch of part 1 of our report. And so we are excited to have all of you with us, and with us in what will be the beginning of a series of launches, because what we've decided to do is to break the report down into 3 separate parts, which I'll explain and walk you through, and launch each one a month apart. We've decided to do this because the richness of the content and the richness of the conversation that each part of the report triggers has been so deep and required a little bit of reflection and time. And so this will allow you to sort of, like an onion, peel away the different layers and hopefully be part of a campaign of making this insight have impact. So we're delighted to have all of you with us. We've also had a few people on the journey with us as well. And so we are really pleased to have 6 of what I'll call our brand ambassadors for mindful exclusion here today, forming a team with us. And forming a team in the sense that although we do work with many different clients and although we do research, you really need to connect with lived experience to understand how concepts come to life. And these 6 people not only have a lot of institutional weight behind them, but they also really live a journey of wanting to be better leaders. And we've learned a whole lot from each one of them. So they have all played a significant role in informing our own view on this topic, and will be speaking today from different angles. Now, for each of these 3 launches, we're going to have 2 who are going to do a longer segment and go into a bit more detail, and 4 who will provide a bit of comment up front and at the end, so that you can get a richer set of perspectives. So that's the format that we'll be using. And then hopefully through that format, you'll see yourself, or you'll relate to at least one of them, if not all 6 of them, and therefore have richer takeaways, because someone around the boardroom table that you may sit at or around the executive may have some common themes that are different than yours that you can see reflected amongst the diversity. So that is a bit of context. And I guess before we start, before I hand it over to our 4 brand ambassadors for a bit of comment, I want to tell you about a study that I didn't do, and one that's actually reasonably famous that you can look up afterwards and that we cite in the report. And that is a study called the Good Samaritan Study. And this was conducted in 1970 at Princeton University in their theological seminary. And they had students who were studying to be priests. Engage in an experiment that they didn't realize was tricking them, where they were on their way to deliver a sermon on the Good Samaritan. And the question was, as they were on their way to deliver a sermon on the Good Samaritan, as part of their larger journey on their way to be priests and to be, people of service, they would come across a man who was coughing and looked ill, and they would have to walk over him in order to get to the place where they were delivering the sermon. And the question was, what percentage of people would stop for that person? What percentage of people would stop for the person who represented the sermon they were about to deliver, who represented why they were, dedicating their lives to what they were doing? So something that was core to their objectives and their purpose. And the answer might surprise you, because really only 45% of these students stopped to help the man. 45%. And that's of students studying to be priests, so that doesn't, numbers will probably be quite low for the rest of us. Now, if they were in a rush, only 10% stopped, 10%. So what you see from that is you see, first of all, that although we may really think that we're living in alignment with our objectives, when we're on our way, when we're sort of in our frame, we can miss things that are essential to our purpose. We can miss things that are aligned with the objectives that are so important to us. So there's a takeaway there also about time and pressure, and how when there's just a little bit of pressure, you're running late, how that distorts even further our ability to notice that thing that we weren't expecting to notice, that thing that is unfamiliar to us, but might actually be closer to our purpose than we realized. So I want to start you off just thinking about that. And the question I want you to have in your head is, do I live in a bubble? Do I live in a bubble? Because if you lived in a bubble, how would you know that you lived in a bubble? And those students who were on their way to do the thing that they thought that they were supposed to do were in a bubble of sorts by that very frame, and therefore missed something. So that's just to start you off. But now let's turn to 4 of our commentators to hear a little intro in terms of what, why this report is meaningful for them, but also what their vantage point is. And what we're going to do is at the very end, hear from them again and get a perspective of what's landing with them, what they take away, and what they want to contribute to the conversation. So I'm going to kick things off with Neil Carberry, CEO of the Recruitment Employment Confederation.
Hi, Justine. Thank you for the opportunity. Really pleased to be here and excited about the campaign. My name is Neil Carberry. I'm Chief Executive of the REC. The REC is the UK's trade association for recruiters, but I have also for the last 7 years been a member of the Low Pay Commission and of the Council of ACAS. So I'm paid to think about how society interacts with business as if they are different things. They're not, of course. They're the same thing in different ways. And in my career, I'm the first in my family to go to university. I've struggled to find the map for how we do governance well. And what I've realized is this question about bubbles is really important, Justine, because I've for years been working on helping companies to understand what sits outside the corporate veil. And that's exactly the same as the kind of thinking about the bubble that you've just linked to. And I'm excited about the discussions we'll have today.
Great, thank you, Neil. And we're really excited to have you here. Next, Justina Lutterodt, Company Secretary at Ostc.
Thank you, Justine. Yes, my name is Justine Lutterodt. I'm a company secretary. I'm a member of an executive team, and I'm also a liveryman at the Worshipful Company of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators. I think this, I guess my journey so far in the output of this report is that actually it's challenged me personally to consider my own bubble and those barriers and my own norms that may be at play that actually impact my sphere of influence and how I contribute to a board's agenda, and thinking about those issues that are very important but that can still be sidelined. And I really see the report as an opportunity to prompt individuals to be honest with themselves and really self-reflect and consider what factors might be at play or hindrances when we are influenced and making decisions, and also to actually consider being much more comfortable and proactive with thinking beyond into the unfamiliar, which can be difficult to do, but actually to be proactive about doing that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Justina, my namesake. Next, Penny Scott Bayfield, Group Finance Director at Bloomsbury.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for including me today. As Justine said, I'm Penny Scott Bayfield. I'm the Group Finance Director of Bloomsbury Publishing. I'm a CFO on a PLC board here in the UK. I'm part of Justine's CSL Changemakers Network, and I'm also part of various CFO networks. It's been a real privilege to have been involved in this mindful exclusion work, and I think the topic has never been more relevant. I'd really love to see us all using the insights that we're going to get today to get out of our bubbles, and then implementing some really quite profound changes to the what, the how, and the who in our boards. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Penny. And last but not least, Anthony Coryette, Company Secretary at BBC Studios.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Like everyone said, it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon to be able to be part of this discussion. I'm Company Secretary at BBC Studios, which is the commercial arm, the production and distribution arm of the BBC. And my journey, my involvement in this was kind of is a weird one, because I didn't really understand I didn't understand initially where we were going with this discussion. And my life has been a journey where I didn't come to being a company secretary in the traditional way. I started out as an actor. You can work out your own punchline for that. But on reflection, I think that's made me more open to change and more open to seeing the unfamiliar, mostly because I was the unfamiliar. My lived experience, my route, my approach to things, my desire to be my authentic self in the workplace is not necessarily what you would expect in corporate Britain. And so for me, what I'm looking for in this discussion today is how we can challenge ourselves as company secretaries away from the being too rigid. Yes, we provide a framework, but we need to be a little less rigid and allow the business to play in their playpen, and we give them some rigidity. But also to be able to recognize the blind spots, to be able to recognize and then be empowered enough or recognize our power to be able to give advice, because that is ultimately our job, to advise the directors. So for me, I want us to be able to challenge ourselves and use the agency, recognize the agency that we have, and then use it, but wisely.
Thank you, Anthony. So superstar team, different perspectives, and that's hence the rich learning that we've had so far. Learning and adventure, because as Anthony said, our starting point for this research was one that was from a slightly different different angle. And I'll explain that as we get into it. So let me now share my screen, and I'm going to share a few slides with you. Before I do that, I'm going to say a couple of things. One is, please feel free to comment in the chat. It's really useful for other people and sort of makes it more stimulating to hear what's resonating and how it sort of manifests for you. I hate one-way lectures, so I'll give one, but I'm apologizing. So for you to be active and commenting will make it more interesting for everyone else. So that's the first thing that I'll say. And the second is that some of what I'm going to present gets a little bit into numbers and charts, and some of you will love that and some of you won't love that. I won't spend too long on it because you can read the report, but don't worry if you're not as connected to that part, because you can still take away the main points, which will bring to life in the stories afterwards. So that's just a warning and a caveat for those who are less into sort of the more academic side of things. So let me now share my screen and walk you through a little bit of the mindful exclusion story. So as I said, this is the beginning of a journey, because this is going to be one of 3 events, and we hope to build momentum as we go along. And there are 3 things that I want you to bear in mind for this journey, and for it to not just be insight, but to have impact. The first thing is Exclusion Matters. And some of you might have found the name a bit provocative, because isn't exclusion a bad thing? But actually what we would say is exclusion is reality. Anytime you include, you're also excluding. Every time you include, you're excluding. And actually there's only so many seats around a table. Let's not pretend that there aren't, although virtually, maybe we can enlarge that. But there's only so many voices you can hear at the same time. There's only so much time that you have. And if you act like you have more time, it won't change the fact that you don't. So as much as we want to be inclusive, exclusion will happen. The question is it happening in a way that's aligned with our values. Because I would argue that how you exclude is what you'll be judged by. How you exclude, and are you excluding the way you intend to exclude? And in order to do that, you have to look beyond your bubble. And in order to do that, you need to know you have a bubble. So our blind spot is our human behavior. Our blind spot is the fact that we don't see what we don't see. And if we have high self-esteem, or if we like to think that we're doing pretty well, then we actually may be invested in thinking that we see everything. And that is our downfall. So human behavior is very much a central theme that you'll see in this research, and that you have to see it. If you're going to own something and you're going to change something, you have to see it. And a lot of times what people can argue about, or problems that people might point to, have been misdiagnosed. We can look at the surface level wound and want to rip off the Band-Aid or put on the Band-Aid or argue about that and miss what's actually going on beneath the surface. And that's one of the intentions in this report. As I said, this is not a new journey. This leg of the journey has had many pieces. A long time ago, and something that we will return to, we did a large, extensive qualitative study on employee network leaders. Some of those insights have informed this, and that would be the point where Anthony was engaging, because it was at the beginning of our journey with the Chartered Governance Institute. We then pivoted and actually translated many of those insights from the opposite perspective, from the perspective of power, to be able to connect the dots. And so what that's involved is an extensive scan of industry reports, everything we could find, to sort of understand what are other people seeing and saying, and what do they have evidence of. And so that was part of the initial sort of investigation. We had 6 roundtables. I think we even had more than that, but 3 up front and 3 more recently on the back of the survey. 20 qualitative interviews that went quite in depth, including our partners at the Chartered Governance Institute, who brought some amazing insights to bear early on. And then we've had this quantitative survey with 310 participants, which is not only a great number, but the timing of this has historical significance. The timing of this survey means it can never be done again. From December 2020 to February 2021, when the whole world is sort of processing a new year, and to sort of get that sort of data at that time is just amazing. And the data doesn't disappoint. So that's a bit of the context that has gotten us here. You'll notice these icons at the top of the screen. These are ones we'll come back to, but you can sort of think of yourself in terms of these images, this being the closed version.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, yes, I've muted it.
When you are what we call bubble bound. And so when you are sort of only seeing things that reflect what you already expect to be there. This icon representing what we call when you are a bubble breaker. You've sort of broken through your bubble, but you're still staying within the norm. This one, what we're calling a mindful manager, where you are going beyond the norm, but not in a way that's massively disrupted. You're responding to disruption. And this one where you're leading the disruption, but because of signals you're picking up in your environment. So these are the 4 sort of icons and segments that we'll return to later. But first, agenda. So as I said, there's 3 sections of the report. We've looked at what it means to exclude in terms of governance. And what that has led us to is to look at exclusion in terms of the agenda, in terms of the dynamics, and in terms of composition. And so that means what issues are making it onto the agenda or not making it onto the agenda. And we're not worried about how high up they are on the agenda. It's just, are they on the agenda ever at all? Secondly, in terms of dynamics, what conversations are being had and what conversations are not being had? And what's the impact of that? And thirdly, composition, the most obvious one, who's in the room and who's getting into the room and who's not, and what's going on there. So 3 forms of exclusion, and 3 forms of exclusion that are essential if you want to have effective governance. Who's in the room, what are they, how are they engaging, and what are they talking about? These are 3 core aspects of decision making. So agenda, which is what we're going to focus on today, is about a transition from being on the back foot to being on the front foot. And I think all of us can relate in different ways to that left side, because COVID has challenged all of us. It's a matter of how much on the back foot, but in some areas we've discovered we might have actually been on the front foot. And so this is about unpackaging why. So I'm going to start with, actually, I'll come back to this slide. I'm going to start with our qualitative research. We and our secondary research, we talked to 20 folks. We had a number of roundtables. So we really were tuning into what are we hearing. And we looked at these industry reports. And what we found really interesting is that certain issues that weren't viewed as important 10 years ago, but are viewed as important now and were viewed as important in 2019, such as digital, such as climate change. There had been a dramatic upswing in terms of the extent to which they were considered important and the ranking of their importance, but that wasn't matched by what we were hearing in terms of prioritization. And we were hearing this from company secretaries in particular saying that, we say this is important, but it doesn't make it onto the agenda. And so that dichotomy of issues that you think are important, but for some reason they're not making it onto the agenda, that was suspicious to us. And so what was also interesting is that they weren't just ESG related. They weren't just holistic. They weren't just people related issues. Those were not making it onto those issues were struggling with some organizations to make it onto the agenda. But in addition to that, there was also technology, digital, innovation, things that were future focused. And what was interesting is the similarity in those two seemingly very different categories, both struggling to make it on the agenda. What did they have in common? They were outside the realm of experience. Both of those were outside the realm of the traditional experience of prioritization. And so they were unfamiliar. And so you might have logical reasons why you didn't put this on the agenda or that on the agenda. But we know in psychology that things that are less familiar to you, you have less energy to prioritize. And there's something known as psychological distance. So psychological distance is how much space things take up in your brain. And so if something is further away from you, it takes up less space in your brain. If something is further into the future, it's called temporal distance, it takes up less space in your brain. If you haven't done something before and it's hypothetical, it takes up less space in your brain. That's something you have done and you can remember. And if someone is someone you don't relate to as much, they take up less space in your brain. So it's all intuitive, but what's interesting is that these four types of psychological distance are interchangeable. So if someone is far away, you tend to prioritize their needs as if their needs are further into the future. In fact, they did an experiment, Hal Hirschfield, I think I'm saying his name correctly, which was on Future Self, where they were looking at how people plan for retirement. And they found that when they asked people to, allocate for retirement, and they didn't do a very good job, but they then met an avatar of their future self, their behavior changed. What they also found is that when they met an avatar of their future self, their brain changed as if they weren't, when they thought about retirement, as if they were thinking about the present. So basically the same part of their brain was lighting up. And by engaging with an avatar of their future self, that distance was reduced. So I'll leave that for now, but that's a really key insight that those types of distance are actually distorting our decision-making because we're human beings, and that they're interchangeable. So who you come across, who you interact with, may affect your perception of time and your experience. So now we looked at a bunch of issues that we had identified as both important and not making it onto the agenda. And we looked at, prior to COVID, because we didn't want to be overly affected by recent events, what were the issues that were not making it onto the agenda? What issues were being excluded? And these are the stats that we found. So these numbers are in some ways not surprising, but actually how high they are is a bit surprising. So 64% of organizations were rarely or never putting climate change on the agenda. Mid to long-term strategy, almost 20%, almost a fifth of organizations were rarely or never having their own mid to long-term strategy on the agenda. So anyways, that was interesting. What we also noticed is that they seem to map roughly into what we'd expect based on psychological distance, because climate change is way into the future. with people who you don't know and who seem far away. Mid to long-term strategy is within traditional norms of what you should prioritize. That's way down here. Blind spots is up here. So that's what we found. That was interesting as a starting point. And here's a little cartoon that sort of brings to life this dynamic of something's not in my experience, so it's probably not an issue. But then we sort of use that insight to divide our respondents into segments. And so we segmented them based on what we know about psychological distance and what we know about organizational life. So if an organization isn't looking into its mid to long-term strategy, there's probably going to be a problem at some point. It's one of the more basic expectations that would be within the context of traditional norms. And so we first segmented organizations based on whether or not, if they said they were not looking at their mid to long-term strategy, we called them the bubble bound, and everyone else we bucketed elsewhere. And what we found is that there were differences across the board, which validates the idea of psychological distance because they're interchangeable, temporal distance, experiential. But the ones who weren't looking at their long-term strategy were, as you would expect, less likely to be thinking about innovation in terms of their future needs, and less likely to be thinking about talent management. These were huge, huge gaps. So we took them out and we assumed they're the most bubble bound. But then we looked at the next aspect of psychological distance, which is, are you looking beyond your not just into the future, but beyond the people who you know, beyond the things that you've experienced before? So we used as a proxy for this, are you looking at blind spots? Are they ever on the agenda? And again, we saw a meaningful set of differences across the board, but differences that not only were across the board, they stood out in terms of their moral nature. So organizations that were looking more for blind spots tended to have huge gaps in terms of diversity and inclusion, climate change. So we saw that. But then they were also showing a difference for things that were more future oriented, such as digital technology innovation. So again, the interchangeability of psychological distance. If you're not looking out for blind spots, you're probably less likely to be thinking of the future as well. So they sort of affect each other, which suggests it's a cognitive thing, not just I believe in this or have this logic type of thing. And then finally, we separated out those who would flex their agenda very quickly. We didn't see big differences here, but we thought it was still meaningful. It came up in the interviews several times, and we thought it's not going to change what gets on your agenda, but it might affect your effectiveness in being able to pivot on these issues. So we divided the segments based on that. And here's a summary. Were they able to look ahead, look beyond, prepare to pivot? And this is also an intuitive way of thinking of three practices. Again, very intuitive, but it can still help to understand why they're important and to challenge yourself. Am I looking ahead? Am I looking beyond? Am I prepared to pivot? And what I'm going to show you now is just how important they are. So we then took a look at sort of what that amounted to in terms of behavior. And so we found that those who were bubble bound, those who were the least likely to sort of look outside their frame of reference, were much more likely to say too much time is allocated to operational and urgent issues. So they were seeing themselves do something that they thought was not very mindful. And that's a huge difference when you compare that across the spectrum of the mindful movers. That same group, the bubble bound, was much less likely to have had three issues that we know were critical during COVID on their agenda: employee well-being, digital, diversity and inclusion. They were not hitting their agenda prior to COVID. These are huge numbers, huge differences. As a result, they were much less likely to believe that their board or executive committee was effective at prioritizing issues for the agenda. So again, huge differences if you compare them to the mindful mover segment. They were more likely to be overwhelmed by the volume of issues. So they're not adding things to their agenda, but they're more overwhelmed. So that's interesting. And then they were less likely to aspire to disrupt sector norms. So it all was fitting the profile of what we had gleaned from the qualitative interviews, but really interesting to see how that all fit together. Another thing that was interesting, because remember, we segmented these based on psychological distance, based on looking across time and looking for blind spots. But those two things also predicted social distance. So the people who were in the mindful mover segment were much likely to be plugging into different voices in their organization to capture ideas. They were also much more likely to invite employees to meetings, to seek out external data, knowledge, expertise, and to value diversity of lived experience, which this one in particular suggests that they're intentionally connecting across difference. And so what I would think may be happening, given what we know from psychology, is that them plugging into different voices is then allowing them to sort of see ahead. It's helping them to look ahead, to look beyond, and be prepared to pivot. Because when you know someone who is experiencing an issue, you can connect with it and know how to prioritize it and feel motivated to prioritize it much more easily. And so these were all very relevant data points. A couple of data points I didn't include here is that they were much more likely, the mindful movers, to have employee networks, much more likely to have employee networks, much more likely to have ombudsman services. So there were many levels with which these groups were plugging in to voices that were not in that bubble. And I think by plugging into those voices, they were then able to be thinking ahead, thinking beyond, that then flowed naturally for our sort of human condition. So here's just a map of the mindless cycle, because this is what we saw from the qualitative that came to life through the data. That first, you're bubble bound. You don't look ahead, you don't look beyond, you don't prepare. Just because you think you already know, you're doing fine. Then, as a result of that, too much time gets allocated to the operational, the urgent, the things that are familiar to you, the things you know you have to do, versus the things that you're not sure how to do, the things you know you want to do versus the things you're not sure you want to do. You're unlikely to bridge social distance. And this group wasn't putting things on their agenda before COVID. As a result, they're on the back foot. They're not confident about prioritizing issues and the effectiveness of that. They're overwhelmed by the number of issues to cover because all of a sudden they're hit by emergencies they hadn't anticipated. And then they have less time. And if they have less time, it's harder to look ahead. It's harder to look beyond. It's harder to prepare to pivot. So it's a reinforcing cycle. And this is just an image that helps bring it home. 5 hours dealing with the current crisis, 5 minutes preventing the next one. We've all been there. If you point your finger at anyone else, just be willing to point it at yourself, because I know I do this. So being able to see it is sort of the first step in many ways. The mindful movers were doing the opposite. They were looking ahead, looking beyond, prepared to pivot. They were engaging with the unfamiliar. Something's unfamiliar. Maybe I don't feel the energy, but actually because I'm socially connected, maybe I do. Or maybe I recognize that this is the point where I may not feel it, so I lean into it. So they were engaging with the unfamiliar before the emergencies. And as a result, they had engaged with employee well-being, digital diversity and inclusion. They were on the front foot when COVID happened. And they're feeling confident. They're not overwhelmed. They're actually aspiring to disrupt, not just respond. And they have more time. And with that more time, they can look ahead more. They can look for blind spots more. So they're on the front foot. And this is just a slight difference in the image where we're preventing the next crisis for 5 hours, which you would argue actually at the top table, you want the rest of the organization to be doing, and you want to be thinking ahead. You want to be anticipating and being strategic. And then 5 minutes, let's just make sure nothing's going wrong. You still need some time there too. What else might be missing? So final slide I'm going to show you here, I think, is just when we look at, oh, it's not the final slide, sorry, I lied. When we look at the bubble bound versus the mindful movers and what happened with COVID, this light line is sort of what was happening before, and the darker line is now. And this is about, did they exclude? So apologies, I should have had a title which would make it easier. What was excluded? What was not on their agenda? And what you see is that employee well-being, diversity and inclusion, these issues, digital, had huge shifts. And actually that's a lot of energy because, a lot of people had to pivot from not having any familiarity to having familiarity. And that is a huge jump from 0 to 1. And And then what's interesting is that there's an across the board movement, even on climate change. People who were very insular, some of them started caring about climate change and making time for it. Some of them started caring about impact on wider society and making time for it. The mindful movers, very few of them didn't have these at all on their agenda. They might not have had them very much on their agenda because it might not have been strategically relevant, but they had some space and therefore they could pivot. And that's why you see that evidence about them being more on the front foot. Climate change was less on their agenda and has shifted some. And this is the last slide, because actually what you see is that in terms of looking ahead, and this is huge, before we defined the segment based on not looking ahead. Now 63% of the bubble bound have mid to long-term strategy on their agenda because they have evidence of the cost of not having it. Those who weren't looking at blind spots now are looking at blind spots. And oh, I think it needs to go on mute. And then with the mindful movers, you don't see a change. So a big shift has happened because of COVID. These three practices do make a difference. The extent of the difference is huge. And what COVID has done is it's given us, in a shorter period of time, a chance to see the impact in a way that's amplified from what we might otherwise see, but probably you would see anyways. So that's the sort of numbers bit, but hopefully you found that interesting. You can go more into that in the report. All of that data is in the report and more. And now I want to turn to, actually, I want to give you a chance to process a little bit. So we've decided to use this format so that you can go into breakout rooms. So we're going to put you in rooms with, I think, 3 people. My colleague Elias will walk you through instructions in a moment. And you're going to have a chance to chat. What I would say would be that when you're meeting with someone, it might be someone who seems just like you. It might be someone who you don't usually have a chance to chat to. Stay in that open, receptive, mindful mover place and just have a conversation about what did you just hear that resonated with you the most. Thank you. Thank you for everyone putting your thoughts on the table. It sort of makes it all richer as we go along. And now we're going to move to our first speaker. So we have Dave Dunkley, CEO of Grant Thornton UK with us. So Dave,
hi, Justine.
Thank you for being part of our team. Can you tell us a little bit about how you relate to these different segments and the idea of being bubble bound or a mindful mover?
Yeah, happy to. And to some degree, they're transient, aren't they? But I've come from a position where I think I put my hand up and say I've operated in a bubble. So to explain a little bit of background. So I've been CEO of Grant Thornton for about 2.5 years. Before that, I've been at Grant Thornton for many years. I was a restructuring professional. So typically brought in to advise companies when they're in a difficult spot as a fixer, someone who rolls their sleeves up, gets stuff done. And it's not a secret as such. Grant Thornton was not having massive problems, but it had some issues 2.5, 3 years ago. And the partners felt it needed someone with a skill set like mine to come in and do a piece of work to fix our profitability, if only get us in a better position, fixing areas like quality as well, which is really important to us. And so I guess I've operated in relatively short timescales in terms of my brief was to go into company, fix it, move on, go into company, fix it, move on. And this is sort of not my first leadership role, but my longest one. And areas we've touched on today, I was cognizant of, I was aware of, and family man, I've got 3 kids, 2 daughters. So none of this is completely alien to me, but I was probably doing enough. And doing enough isn't enough, because it clearly isn't enough. It was, how do I put it, it's of interest to me, but it wasn't a real driver of how I judged my own success. My own success had previously been judged, there's your fire, put it out, move on to your next fire.
So you sort of can see, and as you say, they're states. They're not rigid things deeply in your identity, but you could relate to having been in the bubble bound state.
Absolutely.
Frankly, I think all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, are at times, but you, in some ways, in the way you identified yourself, you were a fixer. So you were thrown into things where you had to find short-term solutions. That was in some ways part of your mandate. Anyways, and then what changed?
I think two things. One is a redefinition of success for me in the business, because that short-term fix and move on, it's not really massively motivational. And the success frame I've got in my head now is to be judged 2 or 3 years after I've stopped doing what I'm doing, as in, can I lay the real groundwork for my firm to be really successful into the future? So much longer term time horizon than I've ever previously worked on. But I think the most powerful thing was speaking to different people in the organization. And all of us have grown up in our own frame, in our own bubble, wherever we come from. And we only view the world through our own eyes. And it's like digression. Anyone else who's colorblind will relate to this. You get asked all the time, does that look red? I have no idea. I've only got my eyes. I've got no reference point. So getting outside of that to a different reference point. And something I did quite early on was speak to people, and that sounds blindingly obvious, but create some really almost intimate relationships with people who've become my reverse mentors. And speaking to people about their experiences growing up, their experiences in the business which I'm CEO of, the processes and the environment we've got for people, what impact that has on them. And the big penny dropping moment for me was there are a myriad of reasons people do not feel they can be themselves and bring their best of themselves to this organization I'm CEO of, and I probably can't see them. The reasons people feel excluded, you've got to ask them and listen to them and think, how can I create an organization where nobody feels excluded? Everybody can come in and be at their very best and be themselves, because actually that brings such a rich diversity of people and ultimately a better organization doing better work. So it's that connectivity to different people who have probably never had an experience of, because I was operating in my fixing bubble, moving around from different companies, taking that time to listen. And there's a couple of heart-wrenching stories of someone I've known for 15 years who's been at Grant Thornton more than once, who identifies LGBT, was out before he joined. He sat next to me for 5 years. He wasn't brave enough to tell me. He left my company and was out at his organisation and rejoined Grant Thornton and wasn't comfortable again until quite recently. And I thought, I've just sat next to this individual for so long, and what sort of organisation are we that he doesn't feel comfortable? How can we break that barrier such that this individual can be themselves at work and therefore be the best of themselves at work?
Now, what I find so interesting about your example, and also having, although I was very impressed with you when I met you, having seen witnessed your sort of transition to becoming, more proactively engaged in this conversation. But what I find so interesting and matches with the data is that it was the reducing the social distance. So someone different from you. So first of all, becoming CEO, all of a sudden you're having conversations with people you weren't having conversations before. So automatically you go from being more bound to more bubble breaker, because whatever version of reality or normal you had has been now disrupted by those conversations. But then what really activated you was this reverse mentorship relationship. And that's important because psychological distance affects your ability to emotionally connect. Sometimes that can actually distort your logic. So it's not purely good or bad, but in terms of finding the energy to prioritize something, understanding why something might be important, there's a lot of natural distortion that takes place. And when you get to know someone and you connect with them, you begin to feel why what they're saying might be important. And all of a sudden you began to understand, to actually feel why inclusion might be something you wanted to make a priority, not just a nice to have, but actually a priority. And you became someone who could then connect the dots, because you've always been skilled at, the profitability bit, but who could connect the dots between the two. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, sort of what that has meant to you in terms of connecting the dots and seeing things in a more holistic manner?
Yeah, I guess the two bits to that. One is that inclusion is a real strong drive for me, and we've adopted the phraseology everyday inclusion, such that the systems we have, the day-to-day decisions we make, are made on a much more inclusive basis, because it starts from a conversation of an individual I spoke to doesn't feel included. And one of the big business dynamics we've had for grants auditors and the industry I'm in. So a lot of what we do is audit, and it's a big topic in a minute. I'm not going to talk too much about audit, but a lot of what the government regulators want us to do is have inquiring people challenging businesses more. And you think, how does this connect to this? Well, you need an environment where people can be themselves, they can speak, and they can question openly. So we can create something in our business which makes it better for an individual. And every advice I give to all our new joiners is, we recruit you because of who you are. Please be yourself, because you'll bring in your richness to this organisation and you'll make the organisation even better. But when you take that to what we do, fundamentally, we advise clients and we challenge the same mechanics we've got, such that this individual's life at work is better, means we're doing better work. So it really does fuel and self-serve and grows, and it is a really virtuous circle because we've got an environment where people can challenge and pick at things.
Two things I want you to just talk about before we close. One is in the midst of COVID, because it's one thing to be a champion and say good things and believe in good things. And frankly, many CEOs are primed by their comms people to know what to say and how to say it and all of that. But COVID has tested people. And in the midst of COVID, you saw yourself doing one thing and you noticed and you switched. And I want you to talk a little bit about what that was like and why, what sort of motivated you. And then before we close, I also want you to talk about your Inclusion Advisory Board.
Okay, so COVID was a crisis, and here comes Dave, the crisis person again, and you rolled your sleeves up. We're going to get through this. We're going to get through this. Quickly realised professional service, it had an impact on us and a massive impact on our people, but actually compared to others, our fire was pretty quickly put out. And we took a really positive decision to keep on our agenda the work we're doing about our purpose and reaching out to 2,000 of our 4,000 people to discuss the sort of firm we want to be. Not now, not how lockdown is 2-3 years, because the fire mentality, someone was dealing with a fire, and when the fire's gone, you need something to replace it. And I'm really keen for our leadership team to engage with all our people and give them confidence, and also good for people's mental health to say, do you know what, this is a business which is more than just a here and now. These things are important to it, and wow, they're important in the crisis. So the first partner meeting we had, having got through the first month of lockdown, was all about, this is our work on diversity, this is our work on purpose, as a real statement to our people and our partners that these things remain important and we are proactively keeping them on our agenda now, because what we keep on now and what we talk about is a real big statement of our intent to make these things last and be there for the future. So I'll touch finally on our Inclusion Advisory Board. You know, we don't have the most diverse leadership team, and no one's going to be surprised. Diversity brings richness of decision makings, and I thought that we could wait for people to come through and be promoted. That's a very long time. So I've taken a different approach. I've created a board of 12 individuals from the business from diverse backgrounds. It's not about D&I in our firm. It's about me being able to make more diverse decisions in my leadership team by asking these people about some real big decisions about our business. And those are decisions such as, how do we set up our offices such that they're more inclusive for everybody in the future and they deliver what our clients want, deliver what our people want? And even as specific as, I want to invest in some overseas territories. They're not as comfortable for many people to work in as they are in the UK. How do you feel about that as 12 people from very diverse backgrounds? And it really, it's such a rich, it's confidential process, that they've all agreed to be confidential, but rich, enhancing process that I've got access, and my leaders have, so much more diversity than if we'd waited 5-6 years, however long it come through a long pipeline, to proactively seek out as diverse as views as we can to make our decisions real, because that means we can always keep extending that bubble. Because whilst you might be bubble bound, the bigger the bubble gets, it's less relevant, isn't it? And we can make our bubble as big as possible. We'll have such a better decisions for the longer term.
It's like you're improving your formula of you're excluding better. And that's sort of the language that is completely consistent with inclusion, but inclusion that actually works is, how do you exclude better? But to exclude better, you need to have a better sense of what you might be missing, so you can factor that in and get better at determining the criteria. And I've watched you sort of actually do this stuff, not just talk about it. And it's been a privilege to see how you've handled it in the midst of COVID, making decisions, not when it's easy, but when it's harder, because that's how you know you can trust something. So thank you so much, Dave, for offering your perspective. We can
Thank
all give
you.
a virtual round of applause in these virtual worlds. And now I want to turn to our next speaker, Michelle Nettles, Chief People and Culture Officer at Manpower Group. Michelle, are you there?
I'm here.
Excellent. So I thought we could start off by reflecting on, how you did look beyond and look ahead prior to COVID, and then how that was beneficial during COVID.
So it's interesting to have heard David's commentary and his interview, and I think about it a little differently because I just joined Manpower Group. I'm now in my 21st month with the company after being 20 years at my prior company. I am the Chief People and Culture Officer at Manpower Group. And for me, our CEO had already made a conscious decision to change and diversify his leadership team. And so it was a new team at the start of COVID. We had only met one time and not the entire team had joined together. So COVID was really an opportunity for us to come together, if you will. And as an organization, we are always at the forefront of talking about the future of work. And so a number of those trends, from climate to diversity and inclusion to talent, those are things that we discuss with our clients every day. And so I wouldn't say that we were fully in the pivot, but we were definitely looking beyond. And so when COVID happened, we literally in 10 days moved our entire workforce to working from home. And this is a workforce, when I joined in the US, we were still 8 to 5 butts in seats. And I was actually shocked that that was the case, that we're 8 to 5 butts in seats. And so we were able to pivot because of being aware, even though we weren't applying it in our everyday, being aware of what those trends are. And that allowed us to pivot. COVID has arguably allowed us to even accelerate those changes. So when we return back to work here in the States and more broadly, we will have a hybrid approach to work and allowing people to dress for their day and work their way, which means that some days you can be in the office, you can join the office for collaboration moments, for celebration moments, for connection moments, but other days you can work from home. And the real test is, are you productive? What we find in that is it helps, and what we're hopeful is that it will help those who requires a bit more flexibility, or to David's point, it will actually bring out the individual's strengths. So some of us work better at different times.
Now, Michelle, I think it's interesting to see both sides of what you're saying, because on the one hand, you were thinking ahead. You were putting out thought leadership on the future of work. So you were thinking ahead, as part of your organization's purpose, and doing so very well, and seeing lots of trends, and they were on the agenda, and therefore you got the benefit of that. But also upon reflection, what would you have done differently? Because I think this moment is a great reflection point for all of us in terms of COVID, in terms of what is the takeaway from this period that you want to take forward.
So what we've done differently, perhaps even gone a bit faster and bolder. I recently heard a CEO of another company say, when your vision isn't bold enough, it's really hard for your organization to understand the nuances. And so as a company whose purpose is rooted in meaningful and sustainable work and job, when I reflect back over the last 21 months, and particularly in the COVID months, could we have even been bolder, and could we have gone faster? And we're now realizing that, rolling out our ESG strategy. And part of that boldness is, historically, we did not have climate as a pillar. And now we have 4 pillars, which include climate to our ESG strategy. And those are things where we kept thinking as a professional service firm, is climate a place that we should be playing? Well, we now know, and we are definitive and very confident that we can play in that space and not just educate and lead the thought leadership in that space.
I think what that highlights is, because you were so actively looking ahead and looking behind, it highlights the importance of that third one, of being prepared to pivot. And in some ways you were ready to pivot, but then the difference between a mindful manager and a mindful mover, that proactive engagement, that willingness to disrupt yourself before disruption hits. So I sort of love that idea of being bolder, being bigger and bolder beforehand. But I also wanted to highlight in the conversations that we've had, and feel free to go on the fly a little here, but that sometimes if you're in a large organization, you don't want to just be bold and make a big decision because it could be the wrong decision. So how do you think about that?
So it's, and I will address this as an individual and then more as a leader. And I'm still stuck at Anthony's intro of his prior career allowed him to be comfortable with the unfamiliar. And I think fundamentally, as an African-American woman born and raised in the U.S. South, so in Florida, you know, I am used to being different, and I'm used to, and I've built a muscle every day of getting comfortable being the different one at the table in the organization, and the best way to be is to be yourself. And so that difference has allowed me in organizations to push in ways that some may not, to see people in ways that others do not, and to be intent on listening and to hearing, and then how to translate that so others can hear it, others can feel it, and hopefully others can act on it. As an HR professional, I think that's what we should be bringing to organizations, the voice that others can't hear. And in the boardroom, you know, in the compensation committee, it's bringing forth, here are the things that our workforce is telling us. Here's the things that our employees are asking for. And the employees now more than ever have a strong voice. They're trying to figure out how to bring that forward. But as employers, we must also remember that they also have a choice. And so now more than ever, employees are voting with their feet, or voting with their voices. And I, as a CHRO, it is important that I bring that to bear in the management table, and that when I'm sitting with board members and directors, that I'm sharing that, so that those voices are heard well before a crisis emerge.
Great. And there's a phrase that we use at CSL called systemic listening. And I think that actually partly what you're describing is from the HR perspective. Well, firstly, you as a leader, who I know are highly skilled at plugging into lots of different voices and ones that others would ignore. But I think the skill of being able to plug into voices that others might not see and might not hear is one that all leaders should have. And from what I understand of the company secretary role, also one that is inherent and sort of has been part of the tradition of that role as well, being able to sense things that others might not sense. And so you seeing that as part of your mandate to sense, but also then to bridge that and bring some of that voice into the room, which we know is a characteristic of the people who are in the mindful mover segment. They are connecting with those voices and actually channeling some of that feedback and emotional content so that others can feel what might be happening next. So I think that that sort of brings something to life. Final thing is in terms of mindful exclusion, and this we're not covering in the report, but I just want to put it on the table to be real, because we looked at who was looking at issues at all or not at all. Then there's the next level of complication, because you can't have everything as your top priority at the same time. You have to exclude. You only have so much time. So if everything is your top priority, you're going to need some strategy for handling that. So how do you, while staying receptive to everything, how do you figure out where to focus at any given time?
And that's, I think you're spot on. That's really, one, listening and understanding what are the priorities for all of our stakeholders, be it our shareholders, be it our employees, be it our clients, our candidates, our associates. It's real-time listening, and then distilling that into where can you be the most impactful. So we are literally in the midst of refining and re-energizing our diversity and inclusion strategy. And in that, it is shifting to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategy, and stepping back, but being very clear of here are the 4 goals that we're focused on, and here's how we can impact it. So someone said earlier, the importance of the what, and those are our goals, and then the how. But then we're bringing along the story, the why, back to those stakeholders and getting them engaged and understanding that this is rooted in, to David's point, our purpose. We are here not for just today, but we are here for tomorrow. And doing that in a way that is crystal clear. And we've done 4 goals and focusing on that. So how do you exclude? It's really hearing what people say are less of a priority than just, not listening. It's, these are the things that surface to the top. So for us, we have a gender goal that we know, wherever you exist in Manpower Group is important. But then we have a local diversity goal that very clearly resonates with anyone in the country that they operate in. And then creating an environment where everyone, and I like David's kind of inclusion for every day, where everyone can be included. We use it as the employee experience. And then what's our societal impact? And tracking that and measuring that. So everyone is clear what we are focused on and what we're not focused on.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for your contribution. And the takeaway there in terms of just having that clarity of purpose, like that big, bold vision, but then that ability to tune in enough to be able to assess without natural distortion. So lots of rich takeaways. If we could show our virtual applause for Michelle and Dave, a sort of superstar team. And now I think we're gonna skip to the part where we hear from the commentators, but it would be great to just hear 1 or 2 people from the audience. Maybe we can have, let's see, I'm gonna call on you and you can just sort of say what's top of mind. Don't worry about it being perfect, but people who have made comments. Jeremy Horsell. Oh, I think you've gone on mute again.
I was unmuted, then I unmuted. Here I am. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers. It's been really interesting. I've been sort of not quite daydreaming, but reflecting very much on where I come from within my organization, my background, and what an enriching experience it has been for me to have my bubble pricked repeatedly, week in, week out. And so to see diversity and inclusion as a genuinely positive opportunity for me as an individual and for our organisation as a whole. And long may that continue for as long as I'm involved with the organisation. So thank you.
Thank you. I love the language of the enriching experience of having my bubble pricked. I think that we tend to think of the painful experience as opposed to the enriching experience. So I like the metaphor there. So great to hear from you. And then I just want to get one other voice on onto the stage to get it a little bit more flowing. Jane Parsons, I just thought if you wanted to share what's top of mind for you, and don't worry if it's just something simple, but if there's anything you wanted to share.
Hi, you woke me up there. No, just joking. No, I've really enjoyed it actually, and I made a comment earlier in the chat, but it was essentially what I was saying is getting some data on what good looks like or what success looks like will really help make the case for executive teams, I think, or directors, or whomever one is dealing with in this universe, for supporting more of this on board agendas and executive team agendas. I think things change. In my experience, things often change a lot when organisations realise that they're behind others. So that's going to be the most useful thing for me, I think, when the upshot of all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. And so glad the data can be useful, but also helpful to know the sort of classification of your state. Because that is one thing at the top, people tend to be reasonably competitive. So being able to tap into that. And actually, we want your help in terms of all of you. As we move from this session to the next, we're going to take a look at all of your comments and questions. So we'll bear that in mind as we design the next session, so it continues to be enriching. But also, as we make posts on social media, feel free to share things you're taking away, things you want other people to take away, so that we can build a bit of momentum and have this be as impactful as possible for a large audience. So your ideas, support in that would be very much appreciated. But I'm now going to pass on to our commentators to say just a little bit each. We have enough time. We have enough time. So let's start with Neil Carberry.
Thank you, Justine. Good afternoon again, everyone. Hope you've enjoyed the session so far. So I've been reflecting on points in my career where I've come across this concept of closing social distance as a way of getting the agenda right, making some progress, and increasing people's attention on areas of potential blind spots. And two things came up to me. One was I worked for the CBI on the introduction of pensions reform in the UK. And the other is my time on the LPC. And in both cases, rather against the mantra of someone who's worked for business organizations for 20 years, I was increasing costs to businesses. And I was persuading them to increase costs. And what worked, and the LPC is a great example of that, is you have to get people to experience the other side. You have to close the social distance through the agenda that you're setting. As an example, the minimum wage rise this month was the toughest discussion I have ever been involved in amongst the 9 of us. But what made it sustainable was the fact that the 9 of us, whether we came from a low-paid worker representative point of view or a business point of view, we'd seen the same people, we'd heard the same stories, we had a shared interpretation of what the truth was. So the agenda itself was closing the social distance and enabling us to make better decisions about where we need to be and to articulate them to our respective constituencies, whether that's in a trade union movement that wants a £10 or £12 minimum wage, or in a business organisation where you're having to talk to hospitality firms who have had the worst year the sector has had in its history. And that closing of the social distance really helps. And for me, my reflection is there's a big difference between what, as leaders, we might advocate and we might accept. And by that, I mean, there are things that we personally think are vital, and they might often be quite short-term metric-driven things. But there are also other things that normally we might think of as philanthropic or nice to do, or things that we'll do when we've got a bit of time to get to them, but others will see them as vital. And it's that shift from the definite article, this is the best way to do things, this is the way we do things here, to the indefinite article, this is a good way to do things, and there are a range of ways in which we could do things here. And for me, remembering, and Kelly mentioned this in the breakout group that we had, but I think it also resonated in Michelle's comments about getting comfortable with being the one that speaks out. As leaders, it's about having reminding yourself how much courage it takes for others to speak out, and then role modeling, creating space for that to happen. And in our industry, the most obvious example of that in the last few months has been those who rushed straight to recruitment's a cash flow business, the cash isn't coming in, we need to cut costs, we focus on the staff bill. And those who thought, how do we get through this, anticipating that this is just a short-term period. And right now, and Michelle's colleagues in the UK will be reporting this to her, you cannot hire an experienced recruitment consultant in the UK. The market is going mad. So everyone who slashed away that stock is actively unable to meet the recovery. So that long-term focus is really vital. That's what I was thinking about, Justine.
Thank you, Neil. Really rich to the point, and I love that from the definite article to that says everything from the way of doing things to a way of doing things. Great. I'm going to ask you all to keep it closer to 2 minutes just so we can make sure all of you come through. And all of these speakers will be featured again in the next seminar where we'll give you more time. So Justine, if you can go next.
Thank you. I mean, there is quite a far-reaching report, so I've got a number of reflection points, but just to express a few, thinking about having the awareness of the bubble, and whether you're a director, whether it's a board, whether you're thinking about yourself as an individual, and how we actually go about removing that invisibility and having enough awareness about that to really then proactively engage in seeking those other voices that are outside of our bubble. So really honing in, thinking about that. Also, as a company secretary and thinking about the agenda, I'd always thought of agenda setting as being quite an impartial, sort of independent exercise, but actually reflecting on some of the outputs of the report and considering how actually the experience of those members of your board can very much steer the agenda. So where you may have a skills or expertise gap on your board, do you then see that mirrored in the gap in the agendas that are going forward? And that's something that has definitely challenged me. Also thinking about the bubble, not just as from a corporate perspective, but as an individual. I was thinking about the diversity, and from my own personal experiences, thinking about where I may not have raised or challenged diversity through a race perspective. And so I had seen gender propelled and the momentum there, but I sort of stepped back and thought, why hadn't I ever really challenged diversity from something that I knew was important out there in the world and was important to myself? And that challenged me to think about my bubble and my norm, which actually impacts what I felt was acceptable to raise at work, you know, and in that corporate setting. So that's definitely something I've taken away. And I'd also say about the importance of being on the front foot of moral issues. So I know it is easy to put those issues or keep putting them off or sidelining them, but actually, if you're an ambitious commercial organisation, you're seeking growth, maybe investment, there will come a time, particularly in due diligence undertakings, where actually those very matters can have a huge bearing on your reputation, just as much as your financial standing. So it's so important to not miss the mark in actually prioritising some of those moral issues. And I guess just to end, I guess I'm thinking to challenge myself about, am I at the mercy of my own bubble? And, you know, if I can ask you all to consider that also.
Thank you, Justina. And it's great to, your sort of different perspectives provoke us all to think a little bit more. So thank you for the self-reflection bit. Next, Penny.
Hi, well, thank you so much for such an insightful session. I think that the biggest insight for me that goes through this whole process, as so many people have said, has been this awareness of my own bubble and what impact that has on my choices about what to exclude. And I think, you know, it's no coincidence that that you and Dave and Michelle have all spoken about listening and how important that is. And so I think, I know that every time I speak to someone outside my sector, my organisation, how much I learn, how much I'm aware of where my assumptions and my bubble is. So I think that's something I actively do and make a real effort to do. I think mentoring, which both Dave and Michelle mentioned, is a hugely powerful tool within that, but that is one thing that I really share as being an absolutely fundamental part of this process. I think, along with all of us over the last 13 months, I've had almost all my assumptions absolutely challenged, shattered, disappearing within the space of days last March, April. And so I think that's demonstrated, that's one small positive, one big positive thing to come out of a very, very tough time, which is still going on, is, we've demonstrated that you can shatter your assumptions and that actually you can't say, well, it's, no, it should be like that. It's always been like that. That's nonsense. So that's a very powerful tool to use to challenge ourselves and those around us when they don't want to be challenged. I think the next section we'll be talking about dynamics. I'm really looking forward to that. I've really noticed how remote working and these endless our Zoom meetings, which unfortunately aren't always as insightful and energizing as we've had today, are something that actually makes our world's actually more insular. It's harder to get out and meet people and do those things. So that's been another part of this process that I've been thinking about. And I think just to finish, my key takeaway from this event is how powerful it is when you got on that mindful cycle. It is a really powerful and energizing and positive place to be. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you especially to Justine and the CSL team for this great work.
Thank you, Penny. And I like that comment about being energizing, because I think that it's, that investment that you make that becomes a habit, that then doesn't require any energy. It becomes assimilated into your norm, but initially might require a lot of energy. Like for those of you who have become a bit more sporty during this period, initially getting out and going for a run or getting your exercise. Last but not least, let's turn to Anthony.
I've found this really quite exciting, actually, because I've got so many different thoughts in my head. I don't know quite how to share them, and I've just hidden my stopwatch so I can't actually see, which is actually I think I'll leave it right where it is so I can't see it. That's perfect. Then I can't be governed by time, the bubble of time. I think that there is we should not forget, it is a real leap to get from being bubble bound to being a mindful mover. And this is a journey for everyone. And I'm definitely at the beginning of this. I'm at different places. It's almost like, the 7 stages of grief, and you do different. Well, I think I'm at different places at different times. Because I'm aware of my bubble, and I'm aware when I step out of it sometimes, and sometimes I'm not of either. And I think it's, for me, I sit and try and work out, what does this mean for me? What does this beautiful report mean for me as a company secretary, right? And it's a truism that company secretaries can work in any organization because the essential nature of the job is the same. And that's true, but only to a point, because the special sauce in that of our job is understanding the business. I work in a creative business, and for me, we need to still bring that rigor to business leaders. Business leaders, on the other hand, who are creatives, will want to flex and be fluid in decision making and how they operate. And it's important for us not to get too bogged down in the rigidity, the structure, the formality. Yeah, there are things that need to be done on time, but we mustn't get to, what was it I said earlier in our group? Oh yeah, get stuck on and showing off our process prowess, because actually all that does is alienate a group. And if you think about it from a creative perspective, it's actually quite a helpful one. Creatives know that we won't understand. We corporate services, we central services, don't understand what it is to make a program. I don't need to, I might think. I just need to be able to be a company secretary. Actually, I ensure that my company secretaries go into that bit of the business and understand the world from their perspective, because it won't make them write minutes better, but what it will do is get them to be more emotionally connected, more emotionally invested in the production, but also it will work the other way. And I've seen that actually happen. So for me, I would say, I try and do this. Let me just very, very quickly say this, Justine. I know it's going to take a little bit more time, but let me just say this, right? I try and look at myself as an iPhone. An iPhone's got a front and a rear camera, right? And the front camera sees in one way and the rear camera in a different. If you want to see it, it's two perspectives. One is I'm an ordinary person, a black man working in an organization, and I look at the organization that way. From a board's perspective, I have the vantage point of seeing the boardroom and how the board sees it. And when I see a blind spot, I've pushed myself to speak up and say, but hang on, that isn't right. I won't go into the specifics, we don't have time. But for me, I think that's really important. And as company secretaries, that's what we can do. We can challenge because we are right at the table. Use the power that we have. Don't be afraid of it. Use it wisely, but use it none the same. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Anthony, and a great sort of rallying call, because I think that everyone in every position can step up as a change maker. But I do believe the perspective of company secretary, there's a large volume of information you have the opportunity to take in, and often some very subtle, sophisticated dynamics that you're dealing with. And you can sort of keep that to yourself, or you can use that strategically. So conversation to return to as we move to dynamics. But for now, with the 1 minute left, I'm going to hand it back to Peter, but also I think we're sharing, since you've hung on to the end, we're sharing the website where you'll be able to download the report. So since you're here, you'll get that. And Peter, handing it over to you.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you, Dave, Michelle, Justina, Penny, Anthony, and Neil. I found that really interesting. I think it's been a really insightful session. I am now going to have to revise much of what I was planning to say, because I think Anthony's just said much of it, because he's right about the agenda. A lot of what we've heard this afternoon has been about setting the agenda, has been about managing the agenda. And for me as a company secretary, that's always been one of the key things that we can do. Somebody described it to me the other day as our superpower as company secretaries, our influence over the agenda. And as Anthony said, sometimes the chair may give you feedback that, you've picked some of the wrong things, but it's there. And I'd always rather be hung for doing something than for not doing something. I said in my introduction, first thing, that it was in the context of our work on diversity that the Institute began its journey with Justine and the CSL team. But we really quickly realized that mindful exclusion addresses a much wider range of issues than that, relating to good governance, beyond boardroom and workforce diversity. I think this afternoon's seminar will give you an idea of some of the places where it's taken us. Both Justine and I were surprised by the level of overlap between some of the issues that thinking about mindful exclusion naturally surfaced, and some of the hot topics that we're looking at in governance issues. So I hope you've found the seminar and the accompanying report interesting. I appreciate you won't have seen the report yet, but as Justine said, Elias has circulated the link, so you can all download it. I've certainly enjoyed the stimulating discussions that have brought it thus far, but it's now over to you to think about what it means for your own approach to decision making, for your own interaction with your boards. I've heard some great ideas already just in this session. Pricking our bubbles is a really interesting way of looking at the issues. And I'd encourage you all to join us for the rest of the journey. The next seminar is on the 4th of June, when Justine will be focusing on dynamics. And finally, one last thought. having considered the criteria on which we base our decisions, we shouldn't be afraid to make them, provided we're doing so mindfully, provided we're doing so having considered the issues. As Justine says in the report, being mindful of exclusion forces us to acknowledge that there is a universe of options that we're not selecting, and in some cases do not even see. And I think that's a really important takeaway for us all, is just to think about what those options might be. So thank you, Justine, thank you, speakers, and thank you everyone else for joining us.